Thank you very much, Daniel. So I think that was a really useful session, really useful to hear the insights and perspectives from the three different, I suppose, jurisdictions, many similarities and some differences between the schemes and how they're structured, how they're operated, and also obviously different timelines, different stages of maturity as well. And what's really useful is where we can learn from each other and those that are further along the road to hear the learnings and the insights is also really useful. I'm sure there's questions from the audience, so if you can please raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you as soon as possible.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Andrea Abrahams. I work with IETA. I had 3 questions, and thank you very much. Honestly, those were fantastic presentations. First of all, just thinking about your point, Daniel, on the just transition and the international dimension of CBAM. I mean, I can absolutely hear what you're saying in terms of it helping to encourage development of carbon pricing schemes elsewhere. But where in third world countries or emerging economies, they've got very low carbon prices, the difference between the euro price and the local price can be really vast. And how does one help bridge that gap? Because it's not necessarily affordable for local economies to be paying the CBAM rate. So sort of linked to that, I'm also really interested in, I know Germany have put up their hands and looking at encouraging the use of international credits in the ETS as allowances decrease. And I'd really be interested in your point of view on that. And then maybe both for Daniel and Matthew, just where you have a CBAM, where you have a carbon tax being paid into CBAM and that country paying the tax allows for the use of credits within their carbon pricing scheme. Is there any consideration to include those carbon prices as a payment of tax, those carbon credits as a payment of tax, or is that carbon credit allowance completely excluded? Thank you.
3 very good questions. Daniel, would you like to take the first one?
Sure, yeah. And it's a question that is actually oftentimes put forward by countries that are still on their way thinking about that policy perspective of carbon pricing. There's research on like how you basically, what carbon prices will actually have as in terms of an effect. And we have the similar discussion in the ETS too, where we don't know the level of the carbon price and it could go well into the triple-digit figures. And then politicians fear, oh my God, then prices will go too high. That will overburden people, so we must safeguard against that. And then if you really look at the options, what to do, you can show that this money, as I said, is not lost. As carbon prices go higher, so does the government revenue. It's really proportional. And then again, you have more money to give back. But you need to think about that redistribution policy before you introduce the carbon price or a cap on your emissions. And so from what I know, and there's also studies on, let's say, really global south countries and their prospects for carbon pricing, including very carbon-intensive countries. I know of South Africa with a very strong coal-fired power sector. There is studies on basically the distributional aspects of carbon pricing. And they show, and I understand the logic, if you then take that money and distribute it, you target the people who are at lower incomes, who are most heavily hit, you can compensate them. You can even overcompensate them. You can make that policy, the technical term would be progressive, so that poorer people benefit more from carbon pricing. So the message would be, yes, you need to really think about that social acceptability and what you do with the money. But second, if you design this well, and you can of course tap advice from many sources, it can even be a good social policy. And that would also be my argument. One must not be afraid of higher carbon prices. But yes, I agree to the point that you need to have some government capacity to be able to do this. That's not so easy in that sense. And maybe then you would go more towards, let's say, upstream systems, where you're pricing a few companies who put fuels into the economy rather than having a rather complicated ETS1 style downstream system where you have many installations to focus on. That's rather complex. So the level of the point of regulation can also make a difference. Maybe so far to that, and then there's the other, or maybe you go.
And the other question was about the consideration of including carbon credit as payment of tax.
Yeah, so at least in the UK context, the way we're thinking about this, we haven't set out in detail exactly how we're going to, what forms of carbon prices paid overseas are going to be, how we deduct them, how we accredit them, all that sort of stuff. But I think in general, we aren't going to impose any requirement on how the proceeds of some sort of international carbon tax would have been spent. So we're not going to require that if you've paid a carbon tax overseas, it has to have been spent on climate policies in order for it to count. Like, we're not going to impose that in general. So I don't think it would rule out. So as long as the carbon price was sufficiently robust and sort of overseen by government, it's not a voluntary scheme, it's sort of obligatory in the country of origin. I don't see any reason why, just because it has also generated international credits or because it's been used on, say, offsetting schemes or whatever, I don't think it'd be for us as the UK government to take a position on whether that was the right thing to do, because we wouldn't do it with other forms of the carbon tax. And I think just on the other points, I'd agree with Daniel in that from a UK government perspective, we are really live to the potential impacts of something like the CBAM on LDCs and the sort of challenges that they face. And so a big focus of our sort of international outreach efforts, we do have an international working group which we invite countries and their governments to sort of input on the design of the policy. We engage them a lot at forums like WTO and other international forums. And we're also sort of keen on sort of supporting them in a sort of technical capacity to sort of set up the kind of robust carbon pricing schemes, perhaps not to the same degree as the UK or EU ETS in terms of the sort of technical complexity of it, but the sort of fundamentals of that is definitely a sort of an important thing for the UK government to make sure that we're not responsible for sort of offshoring emissions to those countries and the sort of negative effects that come with that as well.
So I add to your questions. So the use of offsets has been, of course, problematic in the ETS1. We know this. In the 2010 years, it's really depressed prices. And now, under some political considerations, and as you were referring to, there is now, again, a window of opportunity potentially opening up to have another compliance option. So for companies to purchase more or less emission reductions credits from projects internationally. We'll have to see to what degree the European Commission will follow that route. The German government, newly formed now, has indicated it would support up to 3% high-quality offsets. I personally have to say that I'm still rather skeptical, because we have to see this under the Paris Agreement goals, right, of remaining well below 2 degrees centigrade. That's the global objective temperature-wise. And an offset means you buy some reduction from someone else, but then you are free of mitigating yourself in your jurisdiction. And if I look at the required emission pathways, also at the global level, more or less everyone would need to mitigate at the same time. And so that's why the logic of having offsets under a Paris Agreement temperature target is not so obvious to me, I have to say, but I recognize the interest by industry to go down that route. It's certainly a second best compared to not doing anything. So and the quality and the credits, if they are high quality, they can have a merit. But to really include it into ETS systems, I'm personally more skeptical. I would rather explore, and we'll see what the Commission will do, explore the option of having negative emissions in the European, let's say, geography, for example. So like certificates from storing carbon, maybe bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. These possibilities are, to my understanding, more obvious. In terms of recognizing this under CBAM, again, that question would need to go to the European Commission. They're currently developing the rules, and I think they will be published in the third quarter. So we have to wait to what degree this type of carbon pricing will be recognized under CBAM. But yes, we are seeing an interest internationally. Again, I try to position that there are pros and cons to that.
Thanks for that. I see another hand raised. You could just introduce yourself and your organisation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Graham Thompson from Wave. Thank you very much for the presentations to the panel. It was all very informative. So we are an electric vehicle charge point operator. I was very interested in Daniel's point that Germany have their national trading scheme targeting fossil fuels and transportation. So the question really was to to Matthew and to Berea as to where that might be on the UK and Ireland's roadmap and what sort of timing, if it is on that roadmap.
Marie, would you like to take that question?
Sorry, I didn't quite hear the question. Can you just repeat the question again?
Yes, it was just in relation to the Germany national trading scheme for fossil fuels and transportation, and whether Ireland had on their roadmap bringing in a trading scheme addressing fossil fuels and transportation, obviously to encourage the electrification of fleets, etc.
Well, the scheme, sorry, can you hear me okay? The scheme that we're looking at is obviously ETS 2, which addresses road transport only. You know, we'll be using we're already within the framework of that in that we have permitted fuel suppliers as regulated entities for that system. And you know, it kicked off this year in terms of monitoring, reporting and verification, and the requirement to surrender allowances should start in 2028 unless there's a very big jump in fuel prices. And Ireland has applied for a derogation because we have a carbon tax already that's applied to fuels in the road transport sector. So, as you probably heard, Luca De Carli also mentioned that derogation. So, you know, once our carbon tax is in place in 2028, the fuel suppliers won't be required to go and purchase EU allowances under the ETS 2. And
in terms of timelines, that you said that's from 2028?
2028, yeah. So there won't be a national scheme as such, well, except that there is the national carbon tax. And then the derogation will go from 2028 to 2030. And after that, presumably we will be involved in ETS 2. We will have to go to the market and buy allowances, same as any other European member state. I think at the moment it's just Ireland, Luxembourg and Norway that have applied for the derogation.
So from the UK side, so this is a little bit outside of our area in that we mostly deal with industrial decarbonisation. But I don't really have a lot that I can say on this. I think the main thing to say is that the government is still relatively new and is due to set out its carbon budget delivery plan towards the end of this year. So if there are going to be changes on that front, it might well come as part of that. I think it is worth saying that both on a sort of tax side from the Treasury perspective and also from a sort of spending side, the UK government is doing quite a lot in terms of sort of trying to support the energy transition or the transition to electric vehicles, as well as other sort of forms of sort of things like active travel and things like that sort of are quite key sort of parts of our tax and spending strategy over the coming years. And yeah, unfortunately, we have a spending review outcome in a couple of weeks, so there's not much more I can say about that, unfortunately, at this stage.
Thanks for that. Are there any other questions? I see another hand raised and down here as well.
The CBAM 2 is to apply to transport, but it's not.
No, because the CBAM is striving to protect from.
Oh, sorry, it's not CBAM 2, it's the ETS 2.
Okay.
ETS 2 is to apply to transport.
And heating fuels.
But in most countries, Germany, UK, Ireland, there are large excise taxes on motor fuels. So how effective is it going to be that if a country feels the CBAM goes up, they just reduce the excise taxes? Is there any way of dealing with that so that we continue to put pressure on adjustment in the transport sector?
Well, sorry, as I said, Ireland has applied for the derogation, so we will continue to have our excise duties on the transport fuels until 2030, and after that, it's a matter for central government to. But in the existing ETS directive, there is no derogation beyond 2030 for those member states that have carbon taxes, and Ireland isn't the only member state with carbon tax. There are Sweden and Denmark would have carbon taxes as well, but they're not seeking a derogation. But it's not. It's really something government would have to speak to.
But I'd like to add. So yeah, you're right. I mean, there are high levels also in Germany of excise taxes on these fuels, and they, for the time being, will remain at their current levels. The interesting thing to understand about the ETS2 for transport and heating fuel, so it's also natural gas, for example, in home heating, as well as just fuel for like diesel for home heating, is that there will be a quantitative cap. So that's a real cap and trade system. So the total quantity will be limited. And given the slow progress, talk about in that perspective of reducing carbon in these sectors, there will be a real pressure. And that's why predicting prices is so difficult. So Matt spoke to that. That's the difference from a tax to like a cap and trade system. We're fixing the quantity, and that will mostly go into effect by 2027. There are some mechanisms of, let's say, front loading is the technical term, of like some allowances into the early years in order to smooth the initial prices. But if the legislation stays as it is, that's a real quantitative limit. So we will have potentially substantial carbon prices. They will fluctuate in order to meet these quantitative targets. Yeah.
That's a really useful, I suppose, analysis of it and the complexity. I think I saw another hand raised down here. Yeah. And if we could get a microphone, and if you could just introduce yourself.
My name is Andre Baumann. I'm a researcher at TCD. And in the Irish context, I have a question. So we seem to be missing a big signal for emissions from agriculture. And so as far as I understand ETS, so fertilizer production seems to be covered by ETS, but then on-farm emissions are captured by ESR schemes. And they are known for having issues capturing the actual data that emerges from agriculture. So my question is then, how can we get these on-farm emissions into the whole carbon reporting chain, so to speak, if that's possible?
Maria, that's...
It's not my area of expertise, but we do have a very robust inventory under the EU, under the effort sharing regulation and under the UNFCCC, and we are required every year to report on that. And I know we have been subject to a lot, of regular audits, if you like, by the UNFCCC, by the other member states, the other participating states, and. So I think there are quite robust inventories on agricultural emissions. It has been suggested in the past that ETS could be applied to agriculture, but there is no example really. I think it was mentioned in New Zealand as well, where it has worked up to date. So as far as I know, Ireland isn't planning to opt in the agricultural sector at the moment.
But it's
maybe
not,
it's some,
yeah, and that's not unique to Ireland, as you said.
No, it's not unique to Ireland, but obviously Ireland does have a lot of agricultural emissions. But we are looking at other provisions such as LULUCF and land use change, and how that can be used to reduce our emissions, and that's an important part of our national inventory as well.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe because in a different context, we looked this up for Germany, and the thing to let's say not mix together is that in agriculture you also have emissions from the combustion of fossil fuels. You run tractors, you're heating maybe stables, and these emissions in Germany, they are right now into our national system. They are being priced. But the biggest part of agricultural emissions, and that's the same across Europe, is not from this combustion of fossil fuels, but it's from methane emissions, livestock, also land use practices, the tilling, and also the fertilizer emissions, basic nitrous oxides. So that's the biggest part of emissions from the agricultural sectors across Europe. And they are, in any case, not to be included in the ETS2. The ETS2 offers the option for including the fossil fuel emissions, so from your tractors and the heating of your stables in that case. So we have to think, and that's for the post-2030 discussions in the European policy making, what to do with agriculture, thinking livestock, methane, and the other things I mentioned. Can we account for this in a proper way? Do we want to price this? Do we want to include it in any emissions trading system, 1 or 2, or do it separately? And there, the discussions are underway. I give you a hint. I probably would not recommend including it into any of these systems because it's somewhat different, but we need to address it. So let's see what comes out of it. And on the fossil emissions from the agricultural sector, as I said, we have them in the German system right now, but the new government has decided not to opt them into the ETS2, which is giving us a headache at this point. We already have them in the system, and now we would have to find a way to calculate them out again. I will not comment any further. Thank you.
Thanks for that. I see a couple more hands, and we have a few minutes left for discussion. Our speakers kept very admirably to time, so well done on that.
Hi, thanks. Laura Burke from SSE Renewables. And I just had a question for Maria, just picking up on your point with the LULUCF and applying the ETS system to that. One gap that I was kind of thinking in the back of my head when I was listening to the different presentations was about the emissions from our wetlands and our peatlands. And if the ETS is going to be applied to that, who is going to be paying for those ETS credits then? Is it going to be the agencies, the semi-state agencies responsible for those lands? I suppose the point goes to forestry lands as well. And just be interested to hear more about how that's going to be treated, because I think it's going to be 3.8%, 3.8 tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2030. That's quite a sizable emission rate to be thinking about and missing out maybe in our current systems.
Thanks for your question. Yeah.
Thank you. No, well, the ETS is not going to be applied, but LULUCF flexibilities are there under the effort sharing regulation, and Ireland will be using those. So, I mean, it's subject to the regulations that are in place, the implementing regulations under the effort sharing regulation. But it won't be traded in the same way as allowances are traded for ETS2 in the future.
So as with the earlier comment on the agricultural emissions, it's outside of ETS.
Outside of ETS, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that. And another question?
Hi, yes, my name's Jason Herbert. I'm from Captured Carbon Limited. My question is for Matthew. On the decision to exclude electricity from the UK CBAM, is that something that you see as being reviewed, as of the discussions at the Common Understanding that the UK might move towards being included in EU electricity trading platforms? Would it make sense for the UK to introduce CBAM for electricity? And would that support cross-border trade between ISEM and GB? Thanks.
Thanks very much. So maybe it's worth just sort of saying why we haven't included it in the first instance. So when we were making the scope decision, we were sort of considering, firstly, is it at risk of carbon leakage? Then is it feasible to apply it? Can we do the monitoring, reporting, verification? Can we, is it practical to apply it to these sectors, particularly in 2027? And then finally, we'd sort of think about some of the sort of downstream effects on the UK and sort of whether that works for us. And obviously, a precondition is that it has to be in the UK ETS beforehand. So electricity is in the UK ETS, but I think from our perspective, the carbon leakage question isn't conclusive. And you mentioned Iceland, but actually all of our interconnectors are with countries that are already in the EU ETS. So from a UK position, carbon leakage is not really a concern in the electricity sector because we are only ever importing electricity from countries which are already paying a carbon price. And also have relatively green grids. In theory, of course, our carbon prices could diverge from Europe and there could be a potential risk there, but it's not one that we saw as a really pressing concern given the delivery challenges for 27 anyway. We will be keeping the scope constantly under review. Just a sort of personal hunch is that I don't think from our perspective electricity trading is very high, is very close to the top of our list. It's very feasible, it's very practically difficult to do it for electricity. So I think, I'm not sure where the Commission, how the Commission are finding it, but when we were looking at potentially sort of applying it to electricity, it is a very different good to, steel or cement or whatever that are sort of shipped over in sort of discrete amounts, given the sort of continuous flow and sort of challenges around that. And I know that UK electricity producers particularly are quite concerned about the way in which the sort of green production is going to be accounted for, because obviously they don't pay the ETS, so they can't deduct any carbon price if it's generated from a wind farm. But we only ever export through the interconnectors when there's a lot of wind. So there's lots of concerns that we have, I think, in terms of the way that it's going to apply to the UK, and we wouldn't necessarily want to reapply that on our border. But yeah, to answer your question, we will keep it under review. And in terms of the sort of the connection with the electricity platforms, that's a bit of the reset that I wasn't involved in. So I don't have a lot to say on that. But again, assuming that at some point we do reach an agreement to link our emissions trading schemes, the CBAM exemption will apply to all UK exports of CBAM goods. And if electricity is a EU CBAM good, then it will be exempt from the EU CBAM because we have a link to ETS. So I hope that answers your question, but that's sort of where we've come up on that. Mm-hmm.
Really useful and great to hear the range of questions and to have the opportunity to I suppose, hear the responses as well from the different jurisdictions. Are there any final questions? We have 1 or 2 minutes left while I'm giving people a chance. I might just invite your, I suppose, perspectives on, we heard earlier about the challenge of balancing regulation with I suppose, regulatory burden on operators. So I suppose from the perspective of the regulator, what's your own, I suppose, views on, I suppose, striking that balance and I suppose ensuring as Laura said, the end destination remains the same, but how we can do it more efficiently, maybe. Do you have any thoughts on that?
There was one more question,
yeah.
If you want to take it, or shall I?
Sure, yeah, we can take that question first and then come back.
Hi, I'm Darren McAdam O'Connell. I'm the coordinator of the Cork Transport and Mobility Forum. I quite unsurprisingly had a few questions relating to transport, but I think they've mostly been addressed, other than to say that transport is the one area where we still have rapidly growing emissions, so we do have to do something different on that. But also in terms of the agriculture, and particularly referencing back to Dr. Martin's slide there, looking at the clinker production for cement and the introduction of a reference level. Do you think for agricultural goods, and I'm particularly thinking of beef, that I know it's outside your expertise a little bit, but do you think that the model of a reference emission level per tonne or per kilo or whatever that has been used for clinker production is something that could, should, or perhaps would be used in agricultural production, particularly thinking about beef, whereas while I can see emissions trading for an individual beef farmer is unrealistic, I think setting a reference level which they should meet, exceed, or not, could be a useful way to go. Thanks.
Well, as I said, it's outside my area of expertise, but I do understand that Board BIA had a programme, I presume it's still running, in the past, where they were trying to drive down the national figure for embedded carbon in, if you like, in beef. It's very useful that there are programmes like that there, so that there's a a national plan and policy and education of farmers. And, I'd see that as the way forward at, if you like, a kind of voluntary level, but across the sector, promoted by the bodies who are working in the sector in order to change behaviours in terms of beef production and in other parts of the agricultural economy as well, rather than bringing in emissions trading at the moment.
Can I comment just quickly on, I think this ties to your question about balancing the burden of regulation as well. So I do know that as part of the UK's 2022 consultation on developing the UK ETS, we did look into sort of potentially applying emissions trading or some precursor forms of emissions trading to agriculture. So I didn't raise it earlier because I can't actually remember what we said in response, to my shame. But I do remember one of the sort of factors in that argument, and one of the factors about how do you apply regulation in general, or this kind of regulation, most effectively, is to try and find the sort of most concentrated part of the supply chain or concentrated part of the production process and apply it there. So, for instance, rather than every individual getting, along with their home heating bill, getting an ETS bill or having to participate in the ETS, you apply the ETS to the gas shippers or to somewhere further up the supply chain where participants are more able to sort of participate in that kind of emissions trading environment. And one of the challenges in something like agriculture, I think, is that participants are quite dispersed. And I don't remember exactly if that was the reason that we decided not to do it, but that it was definitely part of the discussions that we were having at the time on that. And so I think, for us, balancing regulation, balancing the burden of that's been really important. It's been critical for our CBAM construction, and we've consulted quite extensively, and HMRC are very keen to make sure that the CBAM has as little burden as possible while maintaining that level of minimum standards, that it is a genuine carbon leakage deterrent and a genuine sort of support to reducing emissions in the UK and globally.
So maybe also in closing, and maybe to broaden it again, I think we should also celebrate the successes of basically those 20 years and where we've come to. We mentioned in several instances from the ETS side the Fit for 55 package that was just agreed 2 years ago or so. Amidst high international tensions, think of Russia's invasion again and the situation in Europe, but European policymakers, the parliament and national governments were able to strike that I think really path-breaking deal. Now is the implementation phase. I think really very good perspectives that were not touched in much detail today, but having shipping in those systems in a more meaningful way, including non-CO2 effects in aviation and the MRV. This is a key part of, let's say, climate forcings by that industry. We need to have the figures right, really keeping the science base up, and then going step by step. Of course, I echo you, Matt, really thinking about what's the least intrusive way of regulating something. But I would maybe say not go minimum objective, but rather, let's say, ambitious objective in line with the targets. So maintaining the targets, but doing something that makes the most sense. And maybe one last word. Sometimes bureaucracy is being put in question, but oftentimes the most bureaucratic rules serve the companies. So free allocation, I guess, Maria, is our biggest, probably biggest thing to work on, and companies really want to maintain this. As we phase out free allocation and go more towards CBAM in a wise way, we will also get rid or reduce bureaucracy by quite a bit. So we are well on our way. Now we're celebrating 20 years of emissions trading. I hope when we celebrate 30 years of emissions trading, we'll be a few steps further down the road.
I think you've just given a perfect wrap up to this session, and we'll end on that positive note. I'd just like to finish by thanking again our three speakers. I might give them another round of applause. And also thank you to everyone for your contributions. I think that was a really interesting discussion. We'll break for lunch, and we're due to reconvene at 2:15 for the afternoon session. So enjoy your lunch, everyone. Thank you.